This video is going to be about some of the things that I do to capture wildlife pictures when I'm out here on safari in Africa. I did a video a while back with only 5 tips in it, so this one's going to expand a bit and go into a bit more detail. I hope you enjoy it. Let's talk a little bit about social media and how we can leverage it to get better pictures while we're on safari. So one of the things that I like to do is go onto Facebook and join a group of an area that I'm going to visit a month or so beforehand, and just start scrolling through the pictures. Get a feel for the place, get a feel for the animals that people are seeing, get a feel for the seasonality. Try and learn and understand where these shots were taken, what time of day, what were the circumstances surrounding them, and then maybe strike up a conversation with anybody whose shot you particularly like and ask them, how did you go and get that shot? Can you share any advice with me? They're more than willing to talk most of the time. You never know. You might even score a set of GPS coordinates for something like a bat-eared fox den, something that you can go and stake out yourself for your own photographs. And there's other resources online, something like the KGALAGADI leopard project is an awesome place to go and get information about the leopards of the area. The leopards are all named, they know them by their spots and where they hang out, and you can glean really useful, up-to-date, current information about leopard sightings so that you've got it in mind when you're traversing or driving through an area. You know, this is a waterhole that this particular leopard hangs out at. Maybe I need to just check in that camel thorn tree, look a little bit deeper. You might see the leopard, and it might be your photograph of that leopard. It may seem obvious, but I think one of the most important things about getting decent photographs on safari is to actually know something about the animals that you're photographing. It's no use having these enormous cameras and all the best gear if you're just driving around like a clueless idiot. It's far more important to know where to point that camera and where the animals might be and what they might be doing. So think about what you're going to be photographing. Maybe write down a list of 5 or 10 animals that you'd like to target and write down something about their behavior. Try and learn about them. For instance, if you're photographing rhino or want to photograph rhino, don't come out here without knowing what a rhino midden is. Learn about it, because when you see one, you know there's going to be a rhino nearby and you can get your shot. I understand that it's hot and dusty on safari and you might want to drive around with your windows up, the aircon on, and a little light opera playing in the background, but please don't do it. I beg you. So much of the experience of safari is bound up with smell and hearing, and it's really important to stay connected to that environment. It's important not just because you should be hot and dusty on safari, it's authentic. It's also important because you can score great photographs using it. I can smell buffalo, I can smell rhino, elephant are significantly pungent. If I can smell them, then I know they're around and I can start to look for them and I might get a shot of them. The other thing is I can hear Swainson's Franklin's, the alarm call in the bushes, and therefore I know there's something in there that I should be aware of too. It's a great way to get better photographs, I promise you. One of the big problems that I have with safari photography is the fact that more often than not I'm trapped inside a vehicle of some description. There's only a few angles of view that I can get. I'm stuck on a level. I can't get low down and photograph up into the eyes of the animal. And I tend often to have that sort of unpleasant superior view, photographing down as if I'm some sort of lordly creature looking down on the animal. And it doesn't really make me feel part of the picture. So what I like to try and do is try and photograph the animal at eye level, if at all possible. And a trick to do that if you're in a big safari vehicle is to try and occupy a seat close to the driver, maybe the first row behind, because you'll be lower down and you won't be getting such an acute angle down towards the animal that you're photographing. So that's a good trick. And then the other thing you can do sometimes, if you're okay with it, is to actually hang your camera out the window and use your phone in Wi-Fi mode to control the camera. We can do that these days, and we can see the image on the screen. We can control depth of field with the aperture, and we can actually get some quite nice shots in that vein as well. So try and vary the angle. It's really hard in a safari vehicle, but if you can, it'll just make your shots that much different to everyone else's. One of the things that is always a problem on a safari, it's a good problem to have though, is that you are confronted by a range of wildlife. Anything from something enormous like an African elephant down to something tiny like a jewel beetle. So what do? You have to carry a vast array of equipment, right? Well, if I'm trying to travel light, I tend to shoot with a medium telephoto zoom lens. And the zoom's really important because you never know what's around the next bend. And having that capability to vary the focal length really gives you an advantage in that situation. You can zoom out and capture your elephant, or you can zoom in and get the close-up of the jewel beetle. If I'm not traveling light, then I tend to go for a different solution, and that's 2 camera bodies and 2 lenses. I'll have a long fixed prime on one camera, and I'll have a telephoto zoom on the other camera, and sometimes, if I'm feeling really profligate, I'll have a third body and I'll have a wide angle lens on that. So at any point I've got a camera to suit the situation ready to go. Now obviously if you do travel in that mode with 3 cameras, you need a bit of space around you, so it tends to be easier to do that if you're driving yourself. One of the big problems that I'm faced with as a wildlife photographer is to find animals and place them in good light, because when you exit the camp in the morning you don't know where anything is, and the light rises and gets strong quite quickly in Africa. So what do? Do you stick with the animal in front of you, or do you drive on and look for something perhaps a little more exotic? Well, I think on balance I tend to prefer the first option. If I've found a species that I want to photograph, it doesn't have to be a leopard or a lion or something like that. Just anything that looks good and is nicely situated, and I'll sit and let that light build over it and try and get my morning shots like that. I find it's a more reliable technique to make sure you've got some photographs in the bank. So what do we do to approach the animal and photograph it? Well, perhaps a little anti-intuitively, I prefer to keep my distance as far as possible. Remember, we've got focal length to play with here. We don't have to go right up next to the creature on the side of the road. So, what I tend to do is just stay back, let that animal interact with its environment and the animals around it, instead of being fearful of me and my vehicle. And what I find is that tends to yield better photographs in the long run. So, when I see an animal ahead of me, pull gently off the road on the side that the animal's on, and this prevents people passing between me and the shot, and then just angle the vehicle slightly so that I can photograph out of this window, and it tends to offer a decent background and the animal is relaxed in front of my camera lens. One of the most important things you can do to improve your photographs when photographing from a vehicle, and it might sound obvious, is to actually switch the engine off. I see so many people sitting taking pictures with the engine running. Those pictures are not going to be as good. There's going to be micro vibrations and pixel blur in the images. These extreme telephotos are very sensitive to any movement. Add to that the high density, high megapixel sensors on today's digital cameras, and you can understand how important it is to have good long lens technique and a solid foundation, a fast shutter speed as well. Turn the ISO up if you have to. It's really important to keep these beasts steady. When we've got an animal lined up in the viewfinder, what are the considerations that we need to think about then? Well, first, I think it's got to be background. How busy is that background? Is there anything we can do to separate the animal from the background and give it a bit of subject isolation? Is it merely a question of utilizing a long telephoto lens, or can we just move slightly to give it a better background? Then what about the light? Is the light steady? Is it changing? Is it variable? If the light's steady like this, what can I do to change it if it's not ideal? Well, in this situation, there's an animal over here. I can just move forward a bit and that light will swing, swing and swing, and I might be able to eliminate the shadows under the eyes that are typical when the light gets a little harsh. And then, what about composition? Well, I like to leave a little bit of space around my wildlife. I like to be able to crop in a bit later, and I think with modern camera bodies we can do that. And because I've got that space, quite often I like that environmental shot. It feels better to me. Then what about other layers in the image? Your typical wildlife image gets a little bit boring. I'll explain why. You've generally got the subject in focus and a blurred out background. You've got that subject isolation. It's quite pleasing, but it doesn't really offer that much sense of depth. So what I like to do is bring a third layer into the equation. I like to place it, if possible, in front of the animal, so that now we've got three things to look at, and we've got depth in the photograph and our eye travels through it. I find that's a really useful technique for wildlife photography. Looking for sign in the bush is really important. So it's like a puzzle. It helps you puzzle out where to find things to photograph. Now, I'm by no means an expert, but I did notice that there's some guano crossing the road here. And when I look up into the tree above, it's dead. And I suspect there's a raptor that sits up there and devours its prey and does its business down on the road below. So I'm going to mentally file that for later and keep an eye on this tree, because at some point I might come back here and see something worth photographing. Something I like to do every now and then is just to stop and sit and listen and smell. When you're driving around in a safari vehicle all day, you tend to lose that connection with the bush. And not only does it make you feel better to stop and listen, but actually you can get some great shots by doing that too. I'm convinced that I only see about 10% of the animals when I'm driving around. So stopping and waiting will reveal little surprises. You might hear some scurrying feet and a dwarf mongoose will come out, or you'll see an agama. You might see some pale chanting goshawks chasing a honey badger looking for food, snakes, all sorts of things that you wouldn't necessarily see if you were driving. It's a great way to not only acclimatize and feel better about where you are because you're stuck in this vehicle the whole time, but also to capture those small animals that you often don't see pictures of because people are too busy chasing carnivores. Quite often if you're homed in on a distant bird or something like that and there's a bit of heat haze in the air, a bit of movement in the car, it becomes difficult to get a sharp shot. So one of the things that you can do to improve that sharpness, and this may be stating to the obvious to some of you, is to turn on live view and use a shutter lockup mode, and then also use a remote trigger or a timer to trigger the camera. And this way you'll minimize that micro blur that you get from your hands shaking on the lens. I think it's worth mentioning that one should be prepared to stay out a long time on safari. So often the advice you get when you come out to Africa is that you go out on a morning game drive, you drive around and then you head back to camp for a leisurely breakfast and siesta before heading out again in the evening. Well, I don't find it works like that. That's some sort of colonial era myth. We're photographers, we need to stay out here to get the shots, and quite often that means staying with the sighting. You never know what's going to happen. It does get really boring. Well, I'm an hour and a half into Cheetah Watch, and as suspected, the most that they've done is get up, have a yawn, stretch around and follow the shade around the tree. But if you're there at the right time, something might happen and you can get the shot. So be prepared to stay out all day, through the heat of the day, in the vehicle. Take a bottle with you to take a leak in. Take some lunch, take some food. Make sure you're well supplied. Make sure you've got lots to drink, and you should be okay. One of the things that I like to do on these hot summer days is to come out a little earlier in the afternoon. There's a lot of heat and churn in the atmosphere, and it rises to form thunderheads which march across the sky in ever closer ranks. And they produce this wonderful shifting tonality of diffuse and interesting light that just creates a patchwork across the grasslands. And the grasslands are shimmering too, because there's a breeze blowing across the golden grass heads. It makes for a captivating scene in which to place large antelope, chest high in that grass, beautiful rolling hills behind, and that subtly shifting light all the time. You click and you click and you click, and you get a different picture every time. For me, it's a very captivating scene. It's been a fantastic day here out at RIETVLEI, and if you liked this video, please don't forget to leave me a like below, and if you'd like to see more of this content, then don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you next time.